When we played Pokemon in-game, Explosion and Self-Destruct were moves we avoided on our own teams. Why would we feint our own Pokemon to do damage, we'd say? That seems so unnecessary to victory. That is, unless you were this guy. But anyway, Explosion was just that annoying thing Electro did to make catching it a pain. The competitive singles scene isn't as easy as cutting through the Elite Four though, and sometimes you'll have to go so far as to use a move that feints your own Pokemon for the greater strategic good. Boom, as it's often referred to, since it also groups in Self-Destruct, which is the weaker, rarer variant, but still used on some Pokemon which didn't have Explosion, namely Snorlax and Mewtwo, is a unique move because it is the ultimate in high risk, high reward. Yes, your Pokemon will faint, but it will also do absolutely enormous damage, so much so that it nigh guarantees the opponent will faint as well, and this kind of power can be an incredible tool, or at least it used to be in the first 4 generations. So in this video, we'll start off by exploring how Boom affected the game in the first 4 generations, and then theorize how the game would have been affected had it never been nerfed. And speaking of explosions, blow up the competition in this team-based RPG because this video is sponsored by Marvel Strike Force. Marvel Strike Force is a visually stunning mobile squad RPG that allows you to assemble a team of superheroes and villains to complete missions in groundbreaking cinematics and dynamic chain combos. When assembling your team, there's lots of different mechanics to consider. For example, in this mission, we have to protect Captain America from a team of 5 Thors. I have Hulk, how fitting, who has Taunt, which basically works like follow me in this game. So I can taunt the enemies to focus him, and I have Luke Cage to give defense boosts to my entire team, and that's just my strategy as someone who just started the game. I got Hulk pretty early through the achievement rewards, and if you're a new player, you can unlock up to 17 total characters within the first 30 days, such as Spider-Man, Deadpool, Thor, Captain America, and more. I will definitely be logging in every day to unlock my favorite Marvel hero, Wolverine. And since I know my audience has that competitive itch, there's PvP modes such as Alliance War and Arena for you to show off your building skills against other worthy opponents. So if you want a sick official Marvel mobile squad RPG and also support the channel to help us produce more content for a limited time this month, if you use the QR code or click the link in the description below, you'll unlock these exclusive characters for free by logging in. And also for a limited time, they've got more codes. Use promo code NIGHT to get 15 Nightcrawler shards and 500 power cores, and promo code MSF6 to get 310 Deadpool shards. And download Marvel Strike Force on iOS or Android devices. To kick things off, some specific mechanics. In addition to already huge base power, Explosion and Self-Destruct had the additional effect of having the opponent's defense. This effectively meant they had doubled their original base power. This is what made Boom so powerful, to the point where even many resist struggled to take the move, to say nothing of how most neutral targets were basically automatic KOs. You didn't even need a particularly strong attack stat to make good use of the move. Look at Gengar, famously very far from being a physical attacker, and yet an amazing user of the move in each of the first 4 generations. And speaking of the first few generations, in the first 3 generations, Explosion had another excellent use for faster Pokemon, since the turn ends the moment a Pokemon is declared fainted. Going first with a Boom user would deny the opponent the chance to use their move. In practice, this was huge, because even if you weren't going to KO something like a Snorlax or Suicune, you could do significant damage to them while exploding and prevent them from using rest. This was an absolutely pivotal part of the game, and changed in Generation 4, where the turn doesn't end just because something fainted, meaning if your Boom didn't KO Suicune, it'd still be able to rest it off. Then Generation 5 came around, and the defense having effect was removed. As a result, Explosion, well, it didn't completely disappear, but it came close. 250 base power is still powerful, but it's no longer anywhere near the auto KO button it was before, or the move that would at least seriously chunk even resist, making it much more difficult to justify in a moveset. It still maintains some use. Most notably, Landorus is strong enough to where it can actually still make use of the move's power, while more generally, it will be seen on fast Stealth Rock leads, not worried about using it for power but rather tempo, in a bid to sacrifice themselves so as to block an opponent's rapid spin or defog, maintaining momentum for their team. Still, it's niche now, and even Lando T's Explosion, strong as it is, tends to be a momentum tool most consistently, as opposed to Boom's glory days of letting even minus attack natured Heatran rip opponents apart. Having said that, given all the insane power creep that's been in place since Gen 5, it is almost surely a good thing that the defensive having Explosion wasn't part of things as well. And with those general mechanics out of the way, let's get into Explosion's history throughout each generation. Additionally, Explosion's base power of 250 turn 500 is well known, as is Self-Destruct's 200 turn 400. However, in Generation 1, they had lower base power. They were still incredibly strong, of course, thanks to the defense having effect, but note the massive disparity in Gen 1 Explosion, clocking in at a quote-unquote only 170 base power turn 340, while Self-Destruct was 130 turn 260. Though since Self-Destruct was almost always used by Snorlax, who got stab on it, it was functionally stronger than any explosion. Indeed, Snorlax's boom was the single strongest move around. With this lower base power, as well as, well, it has to be said, the system of maxed out EVs across the board meaning everything had a good degree of bulk to it, it was more difficult to automatically KO opposing Pokemon. A famous example was Exeggutor. If it wanted to trade with Starmie, it would have to chip it a little before exploding, as its boom would never KO from full health. It topped out at 96.9%. Contrast this with Gen 2, where Eggy's strong boom KO'd Starmie with hilarious ease, doing a minimum of 121%. Or consider Snorlax's boom, which in Gen 2 would drop any neutral target. Even the mighty Suicune took a minimum of 102%. You'd have to look to Lugia and Ubers to find something that stood a chance, and even that was KO'd 56.4% of the time. Meanwhile, in Gen 1, Snorlax's Self-Destruct had a mere 15.4% chance to one-hit KO Tauros, by no means a frail Pokemon, but hardly one you'd expect to take such a strong move. Finally, in Gen 1, a boom against a substitute would not faint the user. This was changed in Stadium and then in Gen 2. Not that it impacted games regularly or anything, as sub itself wasn't too common in Gen 1, since it didn't block status. In Gen 1, in addition to Snorlax and Exeggutor, boom was also an essential part of the movesets of Cloyster and Gengar, as well as Golem before players realized Rhydon hit way harder without having to sacrifice itself. A major part of what made them so threatening, as this was a constant in the first 4 gens, was that they were plenty dangerous without exploding, and the fact that they could explode at any time made them especially scary, meaning the opponent would have to walk on eggshells around them, but sometimes there was no avoiding it. Even Gen 1's lack of normal resist outside of Rhydon and Gengar itself, both of which were threatened by the exploders, while Gengar also tended to blow itself up early, meant neutral hits were usually going off, and thus the trick was trying to catch the boom turn by having a less valuable Pokemon take it, like for instance a sleeping one or one at low health, and so on. However, this was difficult to pull off reliably, and if say Snorlax wanted to boom trade with your Chansey, you'd be hard pressed to stop it. In Generation 2, the increased power of boom featured on the same Pokemon as RBY, as well as newcomer Steelix and Fortress, made boom teams with the strategy of luring in and blowing up counters for the benefit of a sweeping teammate like Vaporeon or Machamp into a legitimate playstyle, and indeed the defining face of offense for an incredibly long time. They cut through the slow stall teams that were previously the face of the metagame and reshaped the tier in their own image. Explosion was also an important tool in dealing with Snorlax, which now completely dominated the tier, and it was completely worth it to sacrifice a Pokemon to take it out or even damage it sufficiently to where it couldn't heal up, because again, turn-ending effect. In fact, Snorlax blowing up on opposing cursed Snorlax with its stunning effective 600 base power Self-Destruct was one of the better checks, if you could land the target, that is. Boom offense was high risk, high reward, theoretically anyway, but it actually wound up being such a consistent playstyle, it eventually became renowned for its reliability as being able to take on just about anything with good play. What made Boom offense's reign particularly impressive is that it was much easier to absorb explosions now. With much improved normal resist, Gengar had actual longevity with leftovers, and the fact that it wasn't played to instantly explode itself, there was another Ghost in Mischievous, and there were plenty other new bulky normal resists capable of taking on many of the exploders in Tyranitar, Skarmory, and the aforementioned Fortress and Steelix, while Golem and Rhydon were also solid. Consider too how often many of these Pokemon were paired together, thus like how in Generation 1 a player couldn't just spam Boom to win because of the lower power. In Generation 2, a player couldn't just spam Boom to win because they risked studding into a normal resist and sacrificing a Pokemon for nothing. And with Gen 2's max out EV system, as well as a lack of choice ban, you weren't exactly crushing those resists either. That would change in Generation 3, which both introduced choice ban and and exchanged the max EV system for the 508 EV limit we've known ever since, as well as also bringing another famous high-powered exploder into the tier, Metagross. However, such was the power of Boom that something with an attack stat as average as fellow newcomer Klados could regularly get use out of it, dropping offensive targets like Salamence, Celebi, and Suicune, and even something as pathetically weak as Regice could use Explosion effectively because its target was the notoriously low defense Blissey. Offensive teams of all sorts loved Boom. You try to counter Metagross with Swampert, it'd blow you up. You'd lose to Dragon Dance, Tyranitar, or Salamence. Regice or Gengar would blow Blissey up, and good night. Zapdos or Calm Minder will rip you apart. The presence of Explosion had to be accounted for in the team builder. If you were answering Swampert with Meta, you were usually opening yourself up to the oldest trick in the book. Raw Boom power was at its peak too, with Choice Band Metagross Explosion shredding absolutely everything in its path. Standard specially defensive Skarmory was cleanly one-hit KO'd, and thus so was pretty much everything else, barring niche picks. Yes, it did 0% to Gengar for its trouble, but seeing as Gengar was mortally terrified at Meteor Mash, it wasn't coming in early in the game, and thus with even Resist unable to stop it from grabbing a KO, it eventually became popular to immediately blow up with Choice Band Metagross and take out a crucial piece of the opponent's core just about no matter what switched in, putting them on the back foot immediately. Such a tactic was so common, it earned the nickname. Insta-booming your band gross was referred to as pulling a Houdini. Of course, one couldn't always be too gung-ho with their booms. This time around, it was for the reason that Protect was far more common. In fact, to the point where it was itself one of the metagame's most defining moves in its own right. Staples like Swampert and Skarmory relied on it for recovery after all, and you were toast if you exploded into a Protect, so you had to be careful. The increased prominence of Substitute, though not quite as far-reaching, was significant as well. For instance, you could try self-destructing on an offensive Suicune, threatening to 2-hit KO your Snorlax with boosted Hydro Pump, but if it pulled out a Substitute, you'd be in deep trouble. Booming as a defensive tool also became much more popular in Gen 3, and of course in RBY, Snorlax boomed to check Zapdos or Tauros notably, while in GSC, Boom was one of the more reliable ways of stopping Growth Vaporeon without Acid Armor from mowing you down. However, it advanced, the influx of stronger, faster threats meant you were not going to be able to counter Pokemon purely defensively nearly as easily, and that involved makeshift checks, and those makeshift checks usually involve Boom, a solid catch-all due to its power being more than sufficient against more offensive targets. These targets could generally take most hits, Dragon Dance Salamence, Swords Dance Heracross, offensive Combine Celebi, and Suicune, but they wouldn't withstand Booms. Hell, in many cases, Boom was still the superior move even against Resist, even if you had a super effective move. For instance, take 3 common normal resistant late game sweepers in Calm Mind Jirachi, Dragon Dance Tyranitar, and Agility Metagross. If you have a Pokemon that is slower and 2-hit KO'd by them, and you want to damage them as much as possible with Snorlax or a Metagross, let's say you didn't want to risk Meteor Mash accuracy against the Tyranitar in this case, or even the occasional Registeel, then you wouldn't choose the super effective Earthquake, you'd choose Boom, because despite the resist, the damage having effect meant it actually did more damage. In Generation 4, Boom not only continued to have to contend with its old enemies of Protect popularity and plenty of powerful normal resist, the Rotom appliances in Platinum most notably, as well as more and more bulky normal resist in Heatran, Bronzong, Empoleon, Magnezone, and the newly viable Scizor. However, Boom also thrived. The newly added Life Orb made it easier than ever to power up Boom, not needing to lock into a move with Choice Band and powering up all moves, not just physical ones. This was particularly excellent for the primarily special attacking Gengar and Heatran who still wanted their booms to do the job against Blissey or bulky waters. Furthermore, the faster pace of play centering around the lead slot setting up Stealth Rock had Explosion deeply entrenched in its detail. Azelf, Metagross, and Heatran, most notably Azelf, helped define the lead metagame and indeed the metagame itself with their auspicious tempo setting via Rocks and Explosion. Two of the most impactful moves in the game back-to-back, which perfectly set the tempo for their teammates, as even Resist wouldn't appreciate taking Azelf's boom. Explosion was all over the place, as well constructed and seemingly unbreakable as the defensive team that dominated the metagame at many points were. The force of Boom was such that it threw a wrench into their core and opened the floodgates for the rest. It didn't even necessarily have to be as obvious as Blissey getting exploded and then something like Empoleon sweeping. Just consider, as one example, the systematic unraveling of a team made possible when Tyranitar absorbs Azelf's explosion and is thus no longer able to check Heatran. In fact, this was a big reason why Wish Protect Jirachi became as effective and popular as it did. It was a defensive staple not vulnerable to getting exploded on, though of course you wouldn't want it anywhere near Heatran. Defensive explosion was everywhere too. Choice Scarf made this strategy much more possible, with Scarf Heatran in particular using it to answer Dragon Dance Gyarados of all things, and by extension, nearly everything else. Scarf Metagross and Magnezone were also apt in this role, as was the occasional Scarf Azelf, but the take a hit and respond booms of Trick Room Bronzong and various utility Metagross and Heatran was widespread in taking on everything from Zapdos to Kingdra to Dragonite, or Salamence when it was in the tier. So now that we are familiar with what Explosion looks like at its peak, let's briefly theorize about what Generation 5 and later would have looked like with a fully powered Boom. Starting with Gen 5, can you say Chaos? Right off the bat, Landorus Incarnate probably would have been banned far more quickly, still in Black and White 1, way before it gained Sheer Force and became a special attacker. No matter how it chose to explode, something with its strength, speed, and threat level, independent of Boom, would have made it absolutely unbearable. As for Landorus Therian, while its lower speed makes it easier to deal with, but Scarf Lando T with a full powered explosion, what a nightmare. With the tier's existing emphasis on protect and fast-paced teams, it probably wouldn't be the most unimaginable thing in the world, but this is not to say it'd be reasonable to deal with either. Let's just save time. Full strength Explosion Landorus Therian would, in every generation, be suspect at the very least. Full strength Explosion would also feature on Heatran, Ferrothorn, Magnezone, and Mew. These Pokemon would most notably gain massive utility against Calm Mind Reuniclus, one of the metagame's most notorious threats, while Heatran and Magnezone would be much better at scaring Chansey and Blissey. And you better believe Azelf and Metagross would still be serious OU Pokemon if they were capable of chunking everything as hard as they did with Boom previously. They would particularly enjoy the lack of Ghost-type Rotom, especially since the replacement Ghost and Jellicent wasn't nearly as splashable. Azelf, Mew, and of course Landorus Therian were already useful Stealth Rock Boom leads, with the latter two often boosting their explosions with normal gem before the gem's ban, and that was mostly with Boom just for tempo. Imagine if they were easily threatening serious damage on everything. These qualities apply to these same Pokemon in Generation 6 OU, except now they are now far more capable of threatening Calm Mind Clefable in particular. You know what else is terrifying? Mega Metagross with a fully powered explosion. Oh, we're not saying players would be keen to blow their Mega up at the first opportunity, but it would tear through something like a Calm Mind boosted Mega Slowbro something fierce. Even base Metagross was used with an Assault Vest set before, and it packed a lot of defensive utility. Now it could do so while also being much more threatening. Some newcomers packed Explosion too, and while we never got to see them at the peak of the move's power, it is interesting to consider what Volcanion and Mega Diancie could have done with the move. Despite its enormous base 160 attack, Diancie likely would have struggled to fit it into its moveset, which is already quite cramped, and there's the fact that it is often checked by steel types to make it even tougher to justify. But the burst in power would have really changed one-on-one matchups against Pokemon like Rotom Wash. Volcanion, on the other hand, is not checked by normal resist, has room to spare in his moveset, and would utterly devastate neutral targets trying to take it on with excellent base 110 attack. Chansey in particular could forget it. Many Volcanion sets could make use of the moves, but Scarf would be particularly great with it, using its boosted speed to increase the number of offensive threats it could check from high health. Now Gen 7 with full powered explosion, that is chaos. In addition to the usual suspects, Z Heatran, already one of the scariest threats around, now with full power explosion, goodness gracious, you can forget about Mega Latias or whatever you think it is checks it actually checking it. You've also got several amazing newcomers packing the move. Blacephalon's base 127 attack is usually completely forgotten, but with Boom, a move it had no trouble slotting into its move pool, it'd be devastating. Celesteela could certainly find a use for the move as well. Most of all though, Magearna, as if it didn't have enough it could do already, as if it needed to be able to threaten its so-called perfect counter Chansey so brutally, as well as everything else. In fact, Assault Vest Magearna did use Explosion, weakened and all, on a few occasions for the burst of power and neutral coverage, letting it leave more of an impact on the foe when at low health. At full power though, the possibilities are endless as they are terrifying, as if you needed more reason to counter Magearna with Magearna, as many did, and even then, a full strength Boom would still chunk it quite decently. It's the same Pokemon in Generation 8. The more interesting dynamic there is what the presence of such a powerful offensive force would do to upend the longevity and bulk focused nature of the tier. Gen 8 OU is known for its extreme slow pace, characterized by lots of Regenerator, heavy duty boots, and switch moves like Slowking's Teleport and Tornadus Therian's U-turn. Though far from impossible, such strategies are incredibly difficult to break consistently, despite the presence of many strong Pokemon in the tier. With Explosion, you take this to a new threat level. Suddenly, Heatran can dispatch Slowking with utter ease. Ferrothorn becomes a genuine threat. Magnezone, Mew, Blacephalon, Volcanion all would provide a major jolt in their ability to generate meaningful offense. And of course, course, we don't even want to get into Landorus Styrian wars, especially in this generation where they can't even hidden power ice anymore. Perhaps they'd even be more GSC Snorlax-esque, exploding on each other and the rest of the teams playing a Lando-less game. One Pokemon in particular would become a major force in Gen 8 OU with a full strength explosion, Regieleki. It would famously go from unable to touch ground types to easily slicing through them, leaving little else besides Ferrothor to answer it. This would make it an absolutely ferocious enabler of Tapu Koko, as well as terrifying in its own right, especially when enabled further by Koko's terrain. The occasional Torkoal used to fuel some teams would get a boost too, able to leave the opponent with a sizable dent when low on health, as well as a safe way of getting his teammates in with as many Sun turns remaining as possible. Finally, in Generation 9, one initially thinks Terra Normal Explosion at full power and goes cold. Yes, you don't necessarily want to sacrifice your Terra user, much like you wouldn't necessarily do so with a Mega Pokemon. But on the other hand, power that stupefying is game-breaking. Having said that, many notable Boom users lost the move in the generational shift, Heatran and Landorus Styrian most notably, and the newly OU Torkoal feels it as a major loss as well. With Glamora and Garganacl as the Boom users, the former having a miserable attack stat, the latter's strength being in defensive play, and not many others still packing the move, it's doubtful that a full-powered explosion would change too much. Then again, Choice Band Metagross would doubtless be frightening. You never want to doubt that. The power of such a move always has potential for innovative players. For all we know, we'd see Galarian Weezing and its Booms rip up OU. And some final words. Perhaps if Boom's defense having effect were to be reintroduced, the moves could receive their original base power, not too dissimilar to how Burn was referred to its RBY original damage per turn of 6.25% after spending gens 2 through 6 dealing 12.5%. They'd still be incredibly strong for current power levels, but not quite as effortlessly capable of insta-dropping neutral targets and shearing through even resist. We would also surely see more use of the overlooked move Misty Explosion, which is like a weaker self-destruct. It sits at quote-unquote only 100 base power. Misty Explosion jumps to base 150 under Misty terrain, which is incredible support, and many of his users have stab on the move. And on top of that, it is a boom that actually hits certain Pokemon super effectively, making it much more threatening, especially when coming from a major threat like Enamorus. Overall, we have to say, it is almost certainly for the better that Explosion and Self-Destruct were nerfed. Carrying the chaos they brought into the early generations into the already insane newer gens might be a little much at times, almost certainly so in the case of everyone's favorite Landorus. Perhaps they were just right for their time and place. In the early gens, the power can be a little lacking, and Explosion is the high strength charge one can utilize to shake things up, but at a severe price. Now in the comments, let us know, what do you think of Boom? Should it have been nerfed or not? Would it have been fine at lower initial base power? Would Misty Explosion be too much if it had defense? What overlooked Pokemon might potentially shine through use of Explosion were it returned to its full strength in these newer generations? Whatever your view, give us a shout and we'll see you next time. Thanks for watching, everyone, and as always, if you liked the video and you want to see more, be sure to subscribe to Fall Swipe Gaming for more weekly Pokemon content. And thank you so much to our patrons for continued support of our videos, and thank you to everyone else watching as well. And thank you so much to our Platinum tier patrons. Thank you so much to Raven Daytona Ring, Sorazan Croxon, Stoneface Colin, Bingleton, Ray Ray, Daniel Isbeast, Glitcherton, Alex Sabo, Funky, and Chika Chihyo for their support of our videos. And follow my crew on these social media platforms. And that's all I got. See you next time, everyone.